Hi there, I'm Jake Riley, and today I'm going to be talking about the level that I created in Mega Man Maker called the Catacombs. I wanted to open up with the section I'm most proud of, and that's where the player learns about the hazards of spikes and how these ramp up the tension and difficulty of the overall level leading to the boss. The player is first introduced to the spikes in this section here, where they learn that they are able to slide underneath them. This section comes shortly after the player learning how to slide itself, where the hazard they need to get under isn't a physical threat to them, but rather an obstacle impeding them from moving forward. This transitions into a new area where the player needs to jump over a spike in a small 1x1 pit. I intentionally made this section to let the player know that spikes are things that they need to avoid on the ground and by sliding underneath them. The spikes are then treated as a regular obstacle, which are combined with the most common enemy in the level after they learn how the spikes work, increasing the tension slightly. There's a bit of blow-off from this tension a few screens after. They expand on the sliding underneath spike skill for a little while, until they reach the drop platforms. The drop platforms introduced later on in the level show the player that they can open up and cause them to fall below. While preparing the player to know that this is a danger, it does so in a relatively safe environment. After the player gets used to the platform being in the game, and understands the rhythm of jumping needed to cross them, the skill is challenged by having the area underneath those same platforms covered in spikes. This, while increasing the tension, challenges the player and gives them a sense of mastery when completing the area. There are some enemies in this segment, but in those areas I have solid platforms for the player to stand on in order to make the difficulty curve less steep. What I had known from the start was that I wanted the level to be underground and in a crypt-like place. Knowing these two things, I got right to work. The starting screen went through two different versions before I finally got to the screen that we see here. The first one was a dark purple with some bricks and a hole in the wall, but as I started to work on the rest of the level, showing how the player would fall deeper into the darkness below, the less the starting screen felt significant. So I got the idea to make the player go through a mausoleum to enter the level. And the mausoleum being above ground needed a setting to reflect that. And to do that, I needed grass. Mega Man Maker had a distinct lack of natural grass in terms of its available tile sets, so I made do with the platform that most looked like blades of grass. The background was also set to night to add a spooky tone that I wanted the level to have. This was emphasized also through the choice of Shade Man's music. Shade Man's music was actually one of the lower choices that I went with, because originally I wanted Skullman to be the boss. We'll talk about that later. To make the player feel like they were falling down into the depths below, I knew that they would need to fall for a bit in order to give the illusion of depth. I made them fall 3 screens to make the player feel as if they fell a great distance, but not to take too much time away from them actually moving themselves. The backgrounds here were particularly important because they were what gave the setting this deep fall. So I went from the starry background above, to a cave with stalactites above, then into the rocky background behind the player that would follow them into the final boss. Speaking of, the final boss originally wasn't going to be Shade Man. In fact, I intended on Skullman being the final encounter. But as I reached him, I noticed that I was dying regularly during testing. After doing a bit more testing, I found my answer. It was because the jumps and techniques that the level was designed to teach the player did not translate into the final boss encounter. I wanted the boss to be reflective of the player learning and mastering the skills that my level taught them, so I decided to look for a new one. Being pressed for time, I knew I couldn't redo the level completely, so I searched for a boss that fit the spooky theme of the level I had built up to that point. In came Shade Man. Shade Man's attack patterns and aesthetic all fit the themes of the level and what it was designed to teach the player perfectly. As the final touch, I went back through the level and completely changed the tile set as the player descended and ascended. The gray tiles didn't give off the feeling of it being dark and old, so I looked for a brick tile that fit the age that I was going for a lot better. In came these dark gray mossy bricks, which added up to fit exactly what I needed. To illustrate to the player that they were entering a darker area and going into a lighter one, I had the bricks going from light to dark then dark to light, to show them that they were getting close to the end. For Shade Man himself, I knew that I wanted the boss to be in a fortress or a castle. So I took the background of a distant medieval town and a river leading up to a large brick spire with the boss doors, and behind lay Shade Man and his twisted fortress with a spooky backdrop. Selecting the enemies for this level was a simple choice. I needed enemies that fit the aesthetic of the level and would be reflective of where it was located. Catacombs are dark, damp, and full of bones and the dead, So I looked through Mega Man Maker's enemy library to find some enemies that fit a skeleton or bone-like appearance. I found Skeleton Joe, Batten, Docron, and Mummura, all of them having a distinctly spooky and dead appearance. The placement of the enemies was dictated by the isolation principle. I would introduce the enemies one by one and then combine them in a scene once the player got acquainted with each of them. Spikes were a big aspect of this level and its latter half, in particular with the section that I talked about when we first started. Spikes were an obstacle that I wanted to implement, however in moderation, as I knew that too many spikes without adequate preparation would lead to player frustration. So I taught them how to deal with multiple spikes before allowing them to test their platforming later on in the level. The player in this level will learn a few things about Mega Man and how to play as they go through the Catacombs. The first lesson being that the moving right is the way to go. After entering the level, they see just Mega Man and a few glowing pickups. I used a sort of carrot and stick approach in order to guide them toward the rest of the level, and that by teaching them to go right, they will be rewarded. Inside of the mausoleum, they encounter their first enemy. Depending on how they react to it, they learn a few lessons. 1. You attack by using the X button on the gamepad. 2. Those glowing objects give you health. 3. Blue doors require keys to be opened. The door here is actually the only door in the game that is required to progress. This was more so to teach the player the importance of keys and that they can be used to open doors. After falling down, the goal of moving right is reinforced by having this wall here that prevents the player from moving left. Then, the player encounters one of the Catacombs locals, Skeleton Joe. Joe, the player will learn, has only one attack. This is due to his distance. After attacking him, they figure out that he is invulnerable after being damaged one time. The player will then keep attacking, establishing that they need to keep attacking some enemies until they die. The enemy after this will teach the player that some enemies may be out of reach for the Mega Buster, and the moving around may be required in order to get to certain items. Or to defeat that enemy, they can use their special weapons. The weapons that the player can use in the level are the Electric Beam and the Acidic Rain, both of which are capable of hitting enemies at higher and lower elevations, a technique that is important to remember for when they reach the boss. As they continue to move forward, there's a section that looks a lot like this, where there is a door on the ground and a health pickup that is just up to the right. This is a pathway that the player can take that will tell them that there are options here, and that both are viable. Going upwards will reward the player with a key and some weapon energy. In introducing Mummura to the player, I knew that I needed to place him far enough away from the player that he could use his attack and show off his animations, just to inform the player as to how they can dodge his attack and how he moves in the scene. Which, he doesn't move at all. However, the player will then learn that he does a very similar thing to Skeleton Joe, in which he becomes invincible after a short period of time. That being after he attacks. Then, we get to the platforming section. Each of the platforms that I have here require a holding down of the A button in order to reach them. This is a pattern that I reinforce and use throughout the level. Shademan is a perfect test for the player after they've learned these skills, as his blast attacks require the player to hold down the A button in order to jump over them, and he flies high above the player, necessitating them to use their special weapons, giving the player a sense of mastery when they have finally bested him. Thank you.